Hello everyone and welcome back. Today I'm doing the most requested video from recent weeks, Rocket League settings. So today we're gonna go over what settings are the best settings, and more specifically, what are the best settings for you. So let's start off with the gameplay settings. The first option is unlimited boost in free play, which is literally what it says. Unlimited boost in free play. I like to keep this on because I like to go fast in free play. But if you want to practice boost management, it's definitely an option you can uncheck, so that you will have to manage your boost in free play as well, which will more reflect the actual game, of course. But I like to keep this option on. So next up is text chat, which I have on allow all. Voice chat I do have disabled since I use Discord as an alternative. I don't think voice chat in-game is very useful anyway. And I do have cross-platform play enabled to get quicker games. The rest is pretty much default, and I like to keep game stat display level on all stats, and that's mainly because I want to see if I high-fived someone after a goal. There's really no other reason. Usually I put it on main stats only. Now for the most requested item, camera settings, let's go through each setting to see what it does. So the first option is camera shake, and you do definitely want to have this off, because if you enable this, you get this very shaky screen whenever you hit the ball, which is definitely not helpful in any way, since it will make it harder for you to read the ball and to get a proper touch, and that will lead into you missing goals, which is not good. The next setting is field of view. I can show this to you guys. So if we have the field of view on 60, we can barely see anything, and this is very bad. I don't recommend this. I usually put mine on 110, and some people do like to put it on like 105. I recommend keeping it between 108 and 110, and definitely put it in 110 if you're not too sure. Next up is the distance. The distance dictates how far the camera is behind your car. This ties in with stiffness as well, but I'll get to that in a little bit. So I have my distance on 260, which is a decent distance from my car, so that I can still see everything around me, but I do still have proper control over my car as well. Usually you want to keep that setting between 260 and 280. Those are like the default values, but of course there are also some extreme settings. Like some people really like to put it as far away as possible, which is okay. Maybe not this, but some people like to put it at like 350 or something, which is absolutely insane, and it really doesn't make sense with the rest of my camera settings. So I'll keep that on 260. Next up is the height. The height is how high the camera is positioned above your car. So I put it on 90, and usually people put it between 90 and 110. Of course, there are some people who like to put it higher or a bit lower than that, but definitely I recommend keeping it between 90 and 110. Next up is the angle at which the camera points towards your car. The angle is also a very important setting. You definitely want to keep that between -5 and -3. Again, you can go beyond those values as well, but I wouldn't recommend it. The thing to keep in mind with angle is that if you put your angle all the way down, so let's try that. We put it all the way like this. If you're dribbling the ball, so for example, if you have this, it might be hard for you to see if you have a near distance to see what's behind the ball. And if you have a higher angle, or actually a lower angle in this case, for example like this, it might be easier to see what's behind the ball more easily. You get more of a top-down view instead of a from behind view. But again, I'll keep it on 4. Next is the stiffness, which definitely ties in with the distance, because the stiffness is how rigidly your camera will follow the car. You want to keep this value between 0.35 and 0.70, somewhere around that range. I have it on 0.45, but sometimes I do change it to 0.50. And again, if you put this value very high, the camera will follow the car very rigidly. So if I put it to 1, for example, as you can see here, you can see that whenever I turn, camera will always directly be in the middle of the screen. Whereas when I put it at my settings, for example, 0.45, it will take a little bit longer for the camera to readjust to the center, which might mean you have a bit less control, but it's definitely easier, and I think it's more pleasant to see. Another thing that stiffness impacts is once you go supersonic, the camera will be farther away from the car when you have a lower stiffness setting. So as you can see here, if I go slow, the camera is relatively close to my car, and then when I go supersonic, it will be a bit farther away. So if I change this setting back to 1, let's see. So it will follow very rigidly. It won't affect it as much, as you can see. Like I said, you want to keep this between 0.35 and 0.70, generally speaking. But as you can see, stiffness 1 is also definitely usable. So if you like doing that, then it's also definitely an option. An example of someone who uses stiffness 1 is actually Lethamir, which he's been quite famous for. If you have watched any of his videos, you'll notice straight away that he uses stiffness 1, which is very fun to see. And next up are the last two settings, swivel speed and transition speed. Swivel speed is basically how fast your right stick will adjust to your movements. So I'm moving it right now and it's not really responding super quick, but just at the speed at which I like it. So if you increase this all the way up to 10, and if you move it, it will be much faster. And whereas you move it downwards, it will go slower, of course. This is definitely preference, really just depends on how you use your right stick, if you even use it at all, but definitely experiment with that to get your best result. Transition speed is personal as well. I put it on 1.3, but I've definitely played with 1.2 or 1 or 1.1 before. It dictates how fast your camera will focus on the ball. So as you can see, it's rather quick for mine. And if you put it on 1, so if we put it all the way, or sorry, if you put it on 2, I mean, then it will just instantly snap back and forth from the ball to your car, as you can see here. And if you put it at 1, it will be much slower, as you can see here. Which I had this at first. If you go through the ranks, you will definitely notice that the pace of the game will be much higher, and therefore it might be useful to put this a bit higher so that you can quickly see where you're headed and where the ball is and back. But again, this is very personal, so do make sure to mess around with that. And you can also invert the swivel controls from your right stick with the last option, but generally I wouldn't recommend it unless you're somehow used to it. But this is, if you go to the left, you want to go to the left. If you want to go to the right, you want to go to the right with your stick, which makes sense to me. So that's what I'd recommend. So now you hopefully have a better understanding of what each setting does, but what should you use? If you're completely new to the game, I recommend taking either my settings or Pro's camera settings as a starting point to then tweak each setting to your preference to fully make them your own. Because what works for insane players like Squishy or Justin might not work for you and me. So here are my settings, but if you want to get the camera settings of Pro's, you can do this in two ways. The first is going to the Liquipedia page of Rocket League. The link will be in the description to that. And then there you can find all the settings for each Pro and you can copy them from there. Now there is another way, but that requires you to have Bacchus mod installed, which only works on PC and not on console. So if you go to the camera preset right here, it might be on default or on custom, but as you can see here, it will show every camera setting of most Pros, I think all of them probably. And you can click, for example, if you want OCALED settings, we'll get OCALED settings right there, which is definitely useful if you want to try something new or see how the Pros have their camera settings set up. Next up are the controls and bindings. Now, since I play with controller, I can only speak for controllers, of course. So I won't be discussing keyboard bindings in this video since I'm not experienced with that. The steering and aerial sensitivity dictate how your controller stick input will translate to game input. So having a higher sensitivity means more precise input, but might result in less control as well. As a starting point, I would definitely recommend changing it from the default value of 1.0 to somewhere from 1.15 to 1.85. Now, there are some outliers. Some people really prefer a much higher sensitivity, but again, that is all preference. I've also heard that console players generally prefer a higher sensitivity, and this might be due to the way consoles handle controller input. I'm not sure about that though. The controller dead zone is the amount you have to move your analog sticks in order for the game to register input. So if you set your controller dead zone at 1, the stick will move right upon input, whereas a dead zone of 0.05, which is my setting, the game will only register input if you move your stick about 5% outwards. Some controllers might suffer from stick drift, which basically means that whenever you don't touch your stick and drive forward with a controller dead zone of 0, your car will steer a bit to the left or right. So here, if you put it to 0, which I don't really recommend, and if I drive forward, you can see my car just doesn't drive straight, and even my right stick makes these weird movements. which is definitely not natural. And putting your controller dead zone a bit higher, so for me 0.05 is pretty good, fixes all this, because so now when I drive I actually go forward instead of sideways, and my right stick won't make these weird movements. Next is the dodge dead zone. This is much like the controller dead zone. It is how far you have to move your analog stick in order for the game to register a dodge. Usually the dodge dead zone is in that range of 0.40 to 0.80. Again, this is preference, but if you're finding yourself backflipping accidentally a lot when going for an aerial, then you might want to increase this value so this won't happen again. So the last few settings are purely preferential, but I have controller vibration disabled and ball camera mode on toggle. Usually you do want to keep this on toggle. There's only a few players who actually put it on hold. These players are from SARP, the predecessor of Rocket League, where this was the default, so I do want to keep this on toggle. Finally, we have arrived at the infamous controller binds. As for my binds, I use the default binds with some adjustments. I have power slide assigned to L1, arrow right and left to L1 and R1 respectively. Now wait a second, arrow right to L1 and arrow left to R1? That can't be right. Well, this is because I was trying to figure out my preferred settings, like you might be. I wanted to assign both arrow buttons, but I didn't look which was which. So I just assigned the first one to left and the second one to right, which is the order in which they appear in the controls tab. I figured out that this was backwards at a LAN party when someone played on my computer and realized it was backwards. But I decided to stick with it since by then I had become very used to these settings. Now let's figure out what binds you should use, and this all depends on your preference of course, and the way you hold the controller. So most people hold their controller with their middle and index fingers on the triggers and do the rest with their thumbs. But some people use claw. So when it comes to binds, there are a few basic rules that you should keep in mind when picking your control binds. As you progress through the ranks and want to learn new movements and mechanics, you will realize sooner or later that binding at least one directional arrow button, either arrow left or right, is very useful since it adds another dimension in which you can move your car in the air, especially combined with your regular stick movement. A great example of this is the tornado spin. Furthermore, some people might prefer to bind regular arrow. I recommend trying it out and seeing what you like most. I don't use regular arrow myself, so I can't speak for that. The next tip I can give is bind power slide. Even though you might think that binding power slide is only useful for a higher ranked player, this is not true. Every time you land, you should hold power slide, as this will help you maintain momentum and recover faster. I have power slide assigned to the same button as arrow right, since arrow only works in the air and power slide only works on the ground. This way you can use less buttons, though it might take some getting used to in the beginning. Here are a few general items you want to pay attention to when binding your controls. First, you should be able to jump, boost and arrow at the same time for maximum flexibility and speed in the air. So to give you an example, I'll show you how I have my buttons binded. So usually, like I said, you should be able to jump, boost and arrow in some direction at the same time, since you want to be able to in the air reposition yourself, boost of course to get height and speed, and you want to jump to get off the ground. And the boosting, jumping and arrowing is very useful if you want to do fast aerials. So the way I do it, I have jump on X, I have boost on circle, and I have arrow on. As you can see on the controller input, I can do all three things at the same time. I just jump, boost, and if I want to arrow in the air, I can arrow. The way I do this, I use jump, boost, and I can switch from ball cam to car cam with my right thumb, so I can press all these buttons at the same time with my thumb. So this has been very useful for me since I can use one finger for 3 buttons, which is definitely very effective. So the next general item you want to pay attention to is that you should be able to jump, boost and power slide at the same time to quickly change directions and get up into the air as fast as possible. So you want to get around the field using boost of course, and you're going to want to drive obviously, but then you want to be able to turn to make quick corrections using power slide, and if you want to get into the air like the previous point, you want to be able to aerial. When binding your buttons, you definitely want to make sure you are able to do these things, otherwise it might get very hard to progress. Alright, the last 3 tabs are really dependent on your preference and your computer, of course, especially the video tab. So since I have a 1440p monitor, I have my resolution on 1440p. I play on full screen mode. I have anti-aliasing off. I have render quality on high, render detail on custom, and I usually put frames per second at 360, which is this new setting where you can put it at the recommended. My monitor is 165 Hz, so I might put this on 165 FPS, but I like to put it a bit higher to give it a bit of headroom, and since my computer can handle it, it's fine. Next up is texture detail, which I have on high quality, world detail, which I have on quality, particle detail on high quality, and I have effect intensity on default. Now, as for most people, I have everything off except transparent goal post, since that's actually useful in the game. I have the rest off to minimize distractions and to optimize performance. Another tip is as well, if your computer is a bit slower, you might want to put these items on performance instead of quality or high quality, since this will give you more frames, which I do think is more useful than having a better looking game. So next up is audio. This is again very much dependent on how your Windows is set up. So mine is on 30 and gameplay is on 50, but again, my Windows sound might be lower or higher. And the rest I do have off, since I find it distracting or a bit annoying to have these on, so that's why I have them off. I have output type on headphones, since I use headphones, dynamic range on default, and the rest I also have default, but the music I have turned off, so these settings don't really matter to me. And if anyone is curious, this is my chat setup. It's pretty generic. I replaced like 1 or 2 things, I think. But yeah, it's not really as important. All right, so these were all my settings. I hope you guys learned something from this. I hope you guys can figure out what controls and camera settings you guys should use. If you find this video helpful, do make sure to give a thumbs up. I don't usually do these videos, so if you guys liked it, do make sure to let me know. Also, don't forget to subscribe, as only a small percentage of people who watch my videos are actually subscribed, and subscribing would really help me out, and you can always unsubscribe at any time, of course. So yeah, that's all from me today, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.
Ride with me if you ride with me, you can slide with me if you feel like 550 on the 5 sticky, come get high with me, that's a deal, right? Ride with me if you ride with me, you can slide with me if you feel like